Thank you for taking time out to watch this instructional video covering the comprehension, annotation, and answers for the PSLE 2023 Booklet B. Now, this passage is rather complex and the questions are rather challenging, so I thought that I would make a video to walk you through the process by which I tackled them. All right, so let's take a look at the first question. All right, always remember to highlight marks that are allocated. In this case, it's 1 mark, so I'm looking at 1 point. The keyword is why, and the writer's parents arranged for her to go out to Aunt Lily's house after school. So I'm looking for the keywords here, right? After school, right? So an arrangement, spend time after school in her house, an arrangement my parents made to put their minds at ease while they were at work. So here is the key, right? It was made in order to put their minds at ease while they were at work. So I'm going to translate that here. They did so to put their minds at ease while they were at work. Okay, so putting their minds at ease while they were at work is the key that provides me with the 1 mark covered by the point. Okay, question 72. That must be the reason why Aunt Lily takes such good care of it. The reason why Aunt Lily takes such good care of it, right, is now analyzed from 2 perspectives. First, what the writer thinks is the reason, and what is Aunt Lily's real reason for taking great care of her sewing machine. Okay, so over here in the first paragraph, we find the answer to what the author thinks, right, here. Right, so I used to think it had magic that could transform cloth into clothes. Right, so what did the writer think? Right, he or she, right? Okay, the writer thought that the sewing machine, right, so I'm just going to follow the lines, had magic that could transform cloth into clothes. All right, so this is my first point. Remember that this is what the writer thinks. And now, what is the real reason that Aunt Lily is taking such great care of it? And that's found a little bit further down in the next paragraph, right? Here, right? So it tells us that she would tell the author stories as she sewed using her prized possession, right? So, therefore, it, right, in this case, it was her prized possession. Right? So prized possession is the key that answers this 1 mark requirement, just as the sewing machine had magic that could transform cloth into clothes was the 1 mark keyword. Right? So be careful here. This question deals with perspective, and it is very important that you get the correct perspective, whether it is from the writer's perspective or from Aunt Lily's perspective, regarding whether the reason is true from their perspective or not. Okay. Next question, what inspired the writer to want to be a seamstress in line 14? So let's look at line 14, and over here we find that particularly impressed by those famous actresses that had engaged her services. Okay, and it says here, one day after listening to one such story, right, I declared to Aunt Lily that I want to be a seamstress when I grow up. So what triggered this declaration? This was triggered by the fact that she was impressed by how famous actresses had engaged her services, right? So over here, she was impressed by how famous actresses had engaged Aunt Lily's services. as a seamstress. Now, it is very important to differentiate between the author and Aunt Lily. In this case, the author, she, is impressed by how famous actresses had engaged Aunt Lily's services, right? And it is important to note that it is her services as a seamstress that are in demand by these famous actresses, therefore inspiring the writer to want to be a seamstress herself. So this is a multi-part answer, very challenging. I repeat again, you must differentiate between the author, she, and Aunt Lily, right? The object of her admiration, and the fact that how her being impressed by the famous actresses that had engaged Aunt Lily's services was as a result of her skill as a seamstress. Okay, so this is very important. Even though it's just 1 mark, you can see that it's actually quite high demand. Okay, question 74. Based on lines 16 to 21, how can you tell that the writer shared a close relationship with Aunt Lily? Okay, so let's go to 16 to 21, looking at evidence of a close relationship, and we can find it right at the beginning, right? So, going to Aunt Lily's house after school was a routine even after I moved on to secondary school. So here you can tell that she's very close to Aunt Lily because she continues to visit her even after there is no longer a need to do so. Remember in primary school, she was doing so because her parents wanted peace of mind, to be at ease, because they knew that she was being taken care of by a trusted relative. But here in secondary school, even after she's more independent, she continues the routine of visiting Aunt Lily's house, right? So I'm going to rephrase that as the evidence that she is close to Aunt Lily. So she continued to visit Aunt Lily after she had moved on to secondary school. Right, so in this case, again, this continued visitation, right, continued to visit Aunt Lily after she had moved on to secondary school, gives us the evidence that she is indeed very close to Aunt Lily, right, more than normally so. Next, question 75. Why Aunt Lily was dejected? Now, the word dejected, right, is a word that challenges your vocabulary. You must know what dejected means, and this, in this case, is like sad, right, or unhappy, right? So we are looking for 2 reasons because it's a 2-mark question, and of course, the word explained fully tells you that there are multi-parts to this answer as well, okay? So 2 marks, 2 reasons why she is unhappy or dejected, right? So you find here that it has come sooner than I'd like it to. What has come sooner, right? It is the retirement, right? So the retirement has come sooner, and her customers are buying ready-made clothes from shopping centers, right? So these are the 2 reasons, reason 1 and reason 2, right? It's very important that you have both these reasons clearly scribed out in your answer to this question, right? So explain fully why Aunt Lily was dejected, right? So first question, first answer to this, she was dejected because her retirement came earlier than she wanted, and her customers were buying ready-made clothes from the shopping centers, right? Was it shopping centers? Yeah, ready-made clothes from shopping centers, right? So here we see the 2 main points that make up this answer. It's a 2-part answer, and it's quite complex, right? So why was she dejected? Because her retirement came earlier than she wanted. And what was the cause of this early retirement? Because her customers were now buying ready-made clothes from the shopping centers and not from her. Okay, so 1 mark here and 1 mark here. As you can see, as I mentioned earlier in this passage, there's a degree of complexity to the answers that requires analysis of the question and the passage very carefully so you do not omit very important points, all right? So it's important that you check your answers, all right? Okay, next question, 76. Okay, so this is a true-false, right? So let's highlight the keywords before we decide whether they're true or false, right? So plan to share her idea in the park. So the keyword here is plan, right? So was it planned or was it spontaneous? Okay, second one, she sold her first patchwork blanket. The keyword is sold and first. So what did Aunt Lily do with her first patchwork blanket? And the third one is the neighbors really liked Aunt Lily's patchwork blanket. So the keyword here is really like, meaning they were not pretending to like it. They really liked it. All right. So first one, let's look for the evidence that the plan to share the idea or the lack of a plan is in the passage. Okay. So let's look over here. Okay. We can see right in this in the first, second, third, fourth paragraph that this idea came about only when the author saw the rainbow, right? In the park. It was not pre-planned, right? So it's not planned. Therefore, it's false, right? It wasn't planned. Okay. The writer only got the idea when she saw a rainbow in the park. And she did not actually plan to share this idea beforehand. Next, Aunt Lily sold the first patchwork blanket. Okay, let's go up to the same paragraph and let's look around to see what happened with the first patchwork blanket. So you see here, days later, Aunt Lily gave me a patchwork blanket made using leftover fabrics from different cloths. So here, the keyword is gave, right? So if you give someone something, right, that means you did not sell. So therefore, this is also false. She did not sell it. False. She gave the first blanket she made, right, to the author. Right? Instead of selling it, she gave it to the author. Okay, and the third one, the neighbors really liked, right, the patchwork blankets that Aunt Lily had sewed for them, right? But you see over here that they continued to rave about her patchwork blanket. So it is indeed true that they really like it. So instead of having their interest fade away, they continued to rave about her patchwork blankets, right? So this is true. They are really in love with her blankets. They continue to rave. And to rave means to praise very enthusiastically, right? To rave about her blankets, right? And this is the evidence that provides us with the fact that it's true, right? Okay, let's go on. Now, this question is rather unusual. Okay, we're not very used to doing these kinds of questions, right? And these kinds of questions establish relationships between different parts in this passage, right? And you need to be very clear about the line references because the first answer depends on the second, or rather the second relies on the first, right? So you need to be very careful about the line reference and the connection between A and B, right? So in this case, how Aunt Lily acted on the good idea, right? It's a good idea that the author gave her about making these blankets from the scraps in 1926, okay? Here. Okay, so she smiled and said it was a good idea. That very night, I heard a familiar clock, clock, clock sound when I walked past the house. So the clock, clock, clock sound means that she was making these blankets, right? So she acted on the author's idea, right? Okay, so over here, how she started to make a patchwork blanket. Okay, and of course we know that in the passage she gave it to the author, right? But then how the author responded to what Aunt Lily did by the passage is here. You should make more and sell them, I exclaimed, right? So now you have to rephrase this part, right, to answer the question. So how did the author act on what Aunt Lily did, right? So Aunt Lily made the patchwork blanket and gave it to the author, and the author or the writer encouraged her to make more of the blankets and to sell them, right? So this was the author's or the writer's response to what Aunt Lily did in A, right? So in A, she started to make a patchwork blanket and she gave it to the author. And how did she respond? The author or the writer responded by encouraging her to make more to sell them, all right? And next, what did Aunt Lily think of the idea? So here, the same idea is being reflected upon. the writer encourages her to make more, but what does Aunt Lily think of this new idea, right? So this new idea here, right? So there's nothing special about my blanket, but thanks for the idea, okay, after much persuasion, which means that she did not think very much of the idea, right? She did not act on it, and she required extra persuasion. She did not think it was a good or practical idea. All right, she did not think it would work. All right, you can also say she did not think it would work. Right? And how did the writer respond? Okay, how did the writer respond when Aunt Lily did that? You see here the response is right here, right? Okay, much persuasion. Okay, so she persuaded Aunt Lily to give it a try. And we know from the passage that that's precisely what she did. She went on to sell many blankets, right? So question 78 is another unusual question. The words on the left column must refer to something in the passage. So this is a reference question. Be very careful, right, how you answer reference questions, because they're very sensitive to the kinds of words that you use, okay? So in line 32, let's go over to line 32. Okay, so if that were true, so what was true? The fact that they supported her out of pity is what that refers to, right? So what does that refer to? It refers to Aunt Lily's neighbors supporting her out of pity. All right? So it's very important that you phrase this to answer the question. So what does the word refer to? The word that refers to Aunt Lily's neighbors supporting her out of pity, right? So it is very, very important that you phrase this to answer the question, because reference questions are very sensitive to how you phrase the answer, right? If you phrase it incorrectly and you don't answer the question, even if your fact is correct, you will not get the mark allocated, all right? Next, handiwork, all right? Let's go back to the same portions of the paragraph. Okay, so I posted pictures of Aunt Lily's handiwork. What is this handiwork? This handiwork always refers back to the patchwork blankets, right? So this refers to the patchwork. It refers to Aunt Lily's patchwork blankets. All right, that's great. So in this case, it's the patchwork blankets that belong to Aunt Lily, or that are made by Aunt Lily. Next, how people around Aunt Lily help to promote her business. So how did they help her business increase and improve, right? So very obviously over here, we find that more people knew about her business by word of mouth. So word of mouth is one way. And then, of course, posted pictures is another way on Instagram, right? Okay, so these are the two ways that her business was promoted: by word of mouth and by Instagram posts. Okay, or pictures posted on Instagram, right? Either one of these ways of expressing it is acceptable, right? So how did they help to promote? Through word of mouth and through Instagram posts or pictures posted on Instagram. Finally, question 80, how the writer applied Aunt Lily's words of wisdom. And let's identify the words of wisdom and let's see how they're applied at the end, right? So her words of wisdom are, when you love your work, your customers will love your work just as much. So these are the proverbial words of wisdom, right? Okay, and how does this apply? Now, this is a almost an on my own question, because I need to apply this principle to the author's application of it in her work life, right? So here, I'm now a nurse, right? And each time my patients thank me, I know Aunt Lily's words of wisdom have served me well. So how do I rephrase this? Now, this is very challenging, right? And this question is arguably the most difficult one in this entire section, but it's 2 marks. So I need 2 parts to this, right? So if you love your work, then your customers or the people will love your work as well, right? Okay, your customers will love your work just as much. So love your work and customers loving your work just as much. These are the 2 parts. So let's translate it, right? In this case, right, the writer found a job she loved nursing. Okay, so first part, if you love your work. In this case, how did the writer apply that word of wisdom? The writer found a job she loved, which is nursing. And then as a result of that, and her patients appreciated her work by thanking her. So this fulfills the second part of the advice, which is your customers will also love your work just as much. So in this case, how did her customers or her patients love her work? By appreciating her through gratitude, right? So found a job she loved, and patients appreciated her work by thanking her, right? So this is 1 mark here, and this is 1 mark here, right? Giving you a grand total of 2 marks. Okay, so I hope that this run through has given you a clearer idea about how to answer the questions, as well as to apply very simple annotation skills to locating and properly phrasing and answering your questions. It is very important that you read the question carefully, you look at the mark requirements, and then you break down your answers such that they fulfill those requirements consistently and systematically, right? So just a bit of an overview. This is what we've done with the passage. Okay, let me just change the arrangement of the passage a little bit. Okay, yeah. So look at how I've annotated each of the answers and how I've identified the keywords and how I've answered those questions, right? So you'll notice that there's a lot of highlighting and annotation. Remember though in PSLE that you are not to highlight the answers, okay? If you need to highlight, use your pen to underline, right? In such a way that it does not obstruct the answers, okay? Right, I hope this has been helpful.